Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bioethics, Philosophy 320. I know I've got a lot of students here from different disciplines, majors, backgrounds, etc. Not all philosophy majors, that's perfectly fine. I hope you enjoy this video and the next that follow. And so let's get started. My name is Jimmy Alfonso Lacan. You can just call me Jimmy. I did my doctorate at the University of Maryland in 2019 in philosophy, and I work in broadly lots of ethical issues of various kinds, like bioethics and environmental ethics and whatnot. So anyway, I thought we'd get started with a brief lecture on first week on consequentialism and deontology. This first lecture is just meant to give you some background and give you a sense of the sorts of tools from philosophy and ethics that we will be applying to bioethics more generally. Then weeks 2 through 8, so 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, we will get into all kinds of cool issues like markets for blood plasma or survival lottery, that sort of thing. So let's get started. So this week, we are talking about consequentialism and deontology as moral theories. It's important to understand that when we talk about moral theories, we're talking about a set of principles or guidelines, roughly, that allow us to make moral decisions in various situations. So a moral theory is kind of like a recipe or a guide to how we should act and how we should live. Deontology and consequentialism are not the only two moral theories. There's a few others. We're not going to go into those for this course. This course is a bit quick and very surfacey, but we are going to focus on consequentialism and deontology because they are two main theories. They're probably the two biggest theories, and you'll probably recognize them as we describe them and talk about them. You've probably had like consequentialist or deontological thoughts in your life if you've ever thought about like public or like social issues or political issues, public events, anything to do with culture war stuff. Like if you watch the news, you'll hear consequentialist and deontological reasoning coming up. They're not called that, but you'll hear those two things. So I like to compare moral theories to something like a casserole recipe, or really any kind of recipe. Insofar as if you follow the recipe for like a tuna casserole recipe or something, if you follow the recipe, you're going to end up with a tuna casserole, right? So it offers prescriptions. So moral theories are prescriptive, that they tell you what you should do in a certain situation. So moral theories are different than scientific theories. Scientific theories are theories that describe the way the world is, and moral theories describe what you should do, like what you're required to do in a given situation. You'll see more as we go along what I'm talking about. So let's begin with consequentialism. And over there, you can, on the left of your screen, you can see a picture of Bill Gates. So consequentialism is this view that an action is morally preferred to the extent that it produces the best consequences compared to the alternatives. So consequentialists really think the only thing that matters about a moral action is its consequences. So for example, if someone does something very nice for somebody else, say they run into a burning building to save somebody's life. Consequentialists think that you should evaluate that person based on the consequences of their actions rather than say their intention. Like maybe their intention was to be was to get attention, or they intended to raise their public profile. They wanted to be seen as attractive to members of the opposite sex, various sorts of things like that. Consequentialists or strict consequentialists would simply say, that doesn't really matter that much so long as the consequences are good, meaning maybe the person runs into the burning building and saves a child from dying. And that would be really what matters. Not the fact that they were motivated by wanting to be popular and be on the news and raise their public profile. So this is compared to the alternatives. So when we think about when you're approaching an action, like running into a building, burning or not, the consequentialists would say you should do that thing which has the best consequences, that action, among your alternatives, among the things that you could choose from. So you could run into a burning building or not, in this case, right? It's a very simple choice, yes or no. And you should do that thing which maximizes the best consequences. Now, maybe you shouldn't run into a burning building if, if you would die and the child would die too, like you wouldn't actually end up saving anybody, you would make yourself worse off. Then in that particular case, then you shouldn't run into the burning building because the consequences of running into it are worse than not. So when assessing moral actions, the only component that really matters is the consequences of those actions. You don't evaluate the actions themselves and you don't evaluate intentions. It's all about consequences. It might be like saving the most people, preventing the most suffering, doing the most good. So for example, Bill Gates perhaps only donates money to avoid taxes. I don't know this for sure. This is just an example, hypothetical made up example. But the consequences of his actions are better than the alternatives. So maybe he donated, $5 billion to African charities or Asian charities, or helping inner cities kids learn how to read better, or improving public libraries or something, right? You can imagine all these like amazing causes. He donates this money, and that has positive consequences. But he only does it to avoid taxes. A strict consequentialist wouldn't care about the intention, so long as the consequences work out. So how his actions affect others, what his actions produce, what it results in, are really what matters. So a consequentialist, in a sense, would say that Bill Gates is a good person because he's done good things, even if, in this example, he's only donating money because he's trying to avoid taxes. In the same way with the person running into the burning building, maybe there's a firefighter or a civilian on the side of the catastrophe, and runs into the burning building, but only because they want to raise their profile, or they want to be seen as attractive, or they want to get news coverage, or they like the thrill. Maybe they like the rush. So that wouldn't matter to the consequentialist if it resulted in lives saved or suffering prevented or something. So consequentialism is a family of theories. It's not just one theory or another. It's a whole family of theories. There's probably anywhere from 8 to 12 different versions of consequentialism, which we're not going to get into. But they all have something in common, right? Which is that they all agree the consequences of your actions are what matters. It's not intentions. It's not the actions themselves. It's what the actions produce. But they disagree on which consequences are those that matter. So some consequentialists are people who are known as utilitarians, and they think really what ultimately matters is pain and pleasure, happiness and suffering. We want to maximize the happiness and the pleasure, like going to an amusement park and riding a roller coaster and having lots of fun, right? Something like that, like happiness, or having job satisfaction, if you enjoy your job, or you enjoy spending time with your family. Your family is not a source of stress, it's a source of support. Those would be good things. Those would be things that are valuable in this view. And then you'd want to minimize suffering, like pain, agony, sadness, grief. These are all things. So maybe it's those things. It's happiness and suffering. You want to maximize the happiness and minimize the suffering. Others think it's satisfying desires, getting people what they want. That's what really matters. And sometimes people want happiness and sometimes they don't. So you can see how this sort of happiness or hedonic consequentialism can conflict with desire satisfaction consequentialism. They're not going to always say the same things. And we're not going to really get into that too much. I want students in this class to appreciate that consequentialism is a family of theories. I want you to understand that there's multiple kinds of consequentialist theories, but really what matters for the purposes of this class is understanding that consequentialism is a family of theories that agree on consequences mattering. There are many different kinds of consequentialism, but if you understand that as a moral theory, broadly speaking, a family of moral theories, consequentialism really only cares about consequences. All right, this is why it's named consequentialism. So you can see that intentions or the actions themselves aren't really what matters. There have been consequentialists, for example, who think if you could get away with stealing money from your grandma and it wouldn't really hurt her that much, perhaps she's got plenty of money, so you take some of her money and you give it to the poor, and that ends up helping the poor a lot. Like maybe you save lives, maybe you prevent a lot of suffering, maybe you increase their happiness. That to the extent that you produce more happiness than suffering, you should steal from grandma. And this is over the long haul. So if you look at all the consequences, how it affects grandma, how it affects you, how it affects the poor, if overall you're producing more happiness than the alternatives and you're minimizing suffering, well, then you should do that. I mean, we'll see in a few minutes that deontologists think this is very wrong. You shouldn't do that. But the point is, you might think the action of stealing is wrong, but a consequentialist doesn't evaluate, strict consequentialists don't evaluate actions themselves. They evaluate the actions based on what the consequences they produce. And if you end up helping a lot of poor people with grandma's money that she doesn't need very much, well, then so much the worse for grandma. You should steal her money, or whoever, like, you know, a best friend, a neighbor. You can fill in whoever you want for that example. But it's really it's the consequences of the theft. If you end up helping people and you enrich the lives of poor folks, make them happier, reduce their suffering, especially compared to the alternatives. The alternatives, what you can do with that money. Like if you let grandma keep it, the consequences aren't going to be as good as if you steal from her secretly, steal some money and give it to the poor people and really help them. So that's important to keep in mind. So contrast that with deontology. Deontology is a very different kind of theory. It's so just to go back a bit, if you've ever heard someone say things like, you know, saving the most amount of lives, or there's a famous Star Trek quote from the original series where I'm blanking on his name, where something that Vulcans say a lot in the Star Trek series, and it's a very consequentialist way of putting things. The many outweigh the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few and the one. That way of thinking, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few and the one, are about maximizing the consequences. It's a consequentialist theory. And aggregate, what matters the most? The needs of the many over the needs of the few and the one. So if you can get into that headspace, if you can get into Spock's headspace, who said that, then you can understand what consequentialism is. It's like saving the most amount of people, saving the most amount of lives by whatever means possible, if necessary. So contrast that with deontology. Deontology is also a family of theories that emphasizes things like rights and duties. So if you've ever heard people talk about the right to life, or you have a duty of beneficence, a duty for generosity, then they're thinking in deontological terms. So deontologists and deontology itself focuses on duties and rights and the actions themselves, and not the consequences of one's actions so much. Deontology really focuses on the rightness and roundness of the action itself and the reasons people act. So if Bill Gates were to give a bunch of money to avoid taxes, let's say, and it had good consequences, it's not that deontologists would deny the consequences were good, but they would say that alone doesn't make Bill Gates a good person. He's a bad person, or at least a selfish person. His actions aren't that laudable. He's only giving away money to get out of paying taxes. It's really not a noble thing. So an example would be a bank robber, as you can see from slide 5. A bank robber who robs a bank, but donates all the money to the poor in Asia and saves thousands of lives. The consequentialists might think, hey, look, if overall you're doing more good than harm by robbing that bank, you're saving lives, the consequences are good, then there's nothing wrong with that action. It's morally laudable. A deontologist would have a very different take and say, well, that's not really the point. The point is you're stealing from a bank, you're violating their rights to property, and you have a duty that you're not fulfilling not to steal. It doesn't matter that the consequences will be good. Some things are just wrong, even if the consequences work out. And we can think of another example, and it's something that is often used to criticize consequentialists. You might think, hey, look, and we're going to get into this next week. So this is going to be very pertinent for next week when we get into the survival lottery. But you might think, look, some healthy person walks into a hospital. They're perfectly healthy. And you think, hey, I've got 5 patients who need different organs, like maybe eyes or a piece of a liver or a kidney or a lung, etc. Right? And you can imagine that if you were to kill this person who's healthy, and let's suppose they're a perfect match for these other 5 patients in need of organs. If I kill the healthy person and take their organs, I can use those organs to save 5 people. So I've maximized, in a sense, happiness and minimize suffering. One person has to suffer, but if 5 people do better, like the quality of their life goes up, they're healthier, they live longer, their families are happier. They never have to know where the organs came from. We can just lie to them and say, they got the organs from a generous donor or a generous benefactor, and that's all they need to know. So we don't have to tell them where the organs came from and guilt them and make them feel bad about it. But we can use that innocent person, kill them, and then use those organs to save 5 people. Well, it's strict consequentialism. And it's more complicated than that, but we're not going to get into those complications for the sake of this class. It's more complicated than that. But generally speaking, if you're a strict consequentialist, that sounds right. If I can kill 1 and save 5, and that's going to maximize happiness and well-being and minimize suffering, well, then I should do it. And the deontologists would say, well, that's very, very wrong. You're murdering someone, you're violating their right to life, you're not fulfilling your duty to not murder people, because it's murder, right? It's an unjustified killing of somebody. It is murder. And it would be wrong. That is morally wrong. You were violating their rights, regardless of the fact that if you sacrifice the 1, you could save the 5. That's not the only moral factor that matters. We matter as individuals, not just, things matter morally for the individual, not just for the group. So we can't just think of the good of the group or maximizing the suffering or the happiness of minimizing suffering. It's not the only factor. And you can see from that example, from the harvesting of the organs, there's something very unfair or wrong about that. It seems like it just sort of strikes you as killing 1 person, innocent person, to save 5 innocent people. There's something off. Well, this is where we get to talk about the trolley problem. It's the classic trolley problem. And I'm going to move my little thing here because it's in the way. Consider the classic trolley problem. So 5 people, and I apologize if folks have heard this before, trolley problems are much more popular than they used to be, but this really nicely illustrates the difference between consequentialism and deontology. So 5 people are tied onto a trolley track. An out-of-control trolley is coming down the track. The trolley can't be stopped unless 1 pulls a lever to divert the trolley, saving 5 but killing 1. What should 1 do? Actually, that's going to bug me. I'm going to stop and correct. Hang on 1 second, folks. I'm going to stop and correct a typo. So bear with me. And then we're going to get back to screen sharing. My apologies. Okay. Sure. All right. So let's start over. 5 people are tied to a trolley track. An out-of-control trolley is coming down the track. The trolley can't be stopped unless 1 pulls a lever to divert the trolley, saving 5, but killing 1. So if you pull the lever, rather than killing 1, it will divert and kill 5. What should you do? Well, consequentialism and deontology are going to give us different answers, right? For a lot of the reasons that we've just gone over. So consequentialism only cares about the consequences. And since by pulling the lever, I can divert the trolley from killing 1 instead to kill 5, the strict consequentialist is going to say, based on the consequences, the action is better than the alternative. 1 should pull the lever. Because in pulling the lever, I've saved 5 people rather than just 1. So 5 people will live, not 1. So the trolley as it is, left to its own devices, is going to kill one person. But if I pull the lever, or excuse me, 5 people. But if I pull the lever, it'll divert the track and it'll kill one. All right, it'll go down an alternate track and kill one. So overall, I'm saving 4 people. Left to its own device. So if I don't do anything, the trolley is bearing down on these 5 people. For whatever reason, they can't move. They're tied to the tracks. That trolley left to its own devices is going to kill those 5 people. But if I pull the lever, it'll only kill one. So if you just look at the consequences, if you just look at, generally speaking, we think, well, those people would live, they'd be happy. I could explain to them I had no choice. So they won't feel, hopefully won't feel guilty. Excuse me. Overall, it looks like that's a way to maximize happiness, is to pull the lever. Now, the deontologist, and deontology in general, would say that one shouldn't pull the lever. That would mean that I caused the death of a person. That is, it's my actions that led to somebody's death. All right. Before I do anything, the trolley is going to kill 5 people, but I didn't cause that. That's a situation that's not of my making. This is something that we're going to get into a little more in next week's lecture about the difference between, if there is any, between killing and letting die. And the deontologist thinks there's a big difference between letting someone die who's already going to die anyway. The way that track's set up, those 5 people are going to die regardless, because that's just the way the system's set up. That's the difference between letting them die and actively killing them. There's a difference between not giving somebody food and they die from lack of food, like they die from starvation, and holding a pillow over their face until they're dead. Another way to put this would be, instead of a switch, you might suppose that you could push a large person in front of the trolley, and the body of the person would stop the trolley, even though the trolley would end up killing that person. And you could save 5 people that way. Right? If I shove this large person in front of the trolley, it'll stop the trolley and the 5 people will be saved. But the one person I shoved will die. So I'm still sacrificing 1 to save 5. Consequentialists, once again, would say that's what you should do, generally speaking. But a lot of people balk at that. They think me actively shoving somebody in front of a trolley, even though it would prevent the death of 5 people, would kill them. So now I'm taking an active part in killing somebody. Is that really the sort of thing that I want to do? Is that the person I am? Is that the person I want to be? So hopefully the trolley problem, the classic trolley problem, the running into the fire to save the children, Bill Gates donating money because he's greedy but to save people, robbing a bank and robbing grandma to help other people. You can start seeing how the differences will play out between the deontologist and the consequentialist. If you want to think consequentialism is a family of theories and really understand it in a nutshell, it has a lot to do with the consequences and very little to do with the action or the intentions. Generally speaking, consequentialists don't care about that. Whereas the deontologist cares about things like rights and duties. If you're violating the rights of people, if you're not fulfilling your own duties, these are moral tasks that you are obligated to fulfill, then it doesn't really matter what the consequences are. You're doing something wrong. Now, most people aren't either a strict consequentialist or a strict deontologist. Most people have intuitions that are somewhere in the middle. You have some consequentialist intuitions and some deontological consequences or intuitions. But I'm just giving you the theories as contrast cases, just so you can understand why consequentialism and deontology differ. And you can see these things play out next week when we talk about the survival lottery and how, from a consequentialist point of view, the survival lottery makes a lot of sense, but deontologists will balk at it, even though the argument goes it will end up saving more lives than it costs. So, and keep this in mind, go over this, do the readings on consequentialism and deontology. I will be sending around an email, if you haven't gotten it yet, check your inbox, laying out the class and how it works. And what to expect, the assignments, etc. The syllabus is up on Canvas. Please check that out. And next week, we're going to talk about Next, we're going to talk about survival lottery. So.